Respect isn't something you earn by money. It's something you give when no one's watching. The words didn't exist yet in the air that night, but somehow, they were already waiting to be spoken. The restaurant buzzed with the low hum of clinking glasses and quiet conversations, soft jazz curling through the warm lighting that painted everything in gold. It was the kind of place where people came to feel important, where every plate was arranged like art, and every guest expected to be treated like they mattered more than the next. But in the corner, near the service entrance where the light barely reached, a man in a faded gray apron scrubbed dishes with slow, deliberate motions, his head down, his presence almost invisible. No one noticed him, and that was exactly the point. Ethan Cole, the man who owned every square foot of this restaurant, every polished table, every glowing chandelier, stood there pretending to be no one. His hands moved through warm water and soap, but his eyes, sharp, observant, missed nothing. He had built this place from nothing, turned it into one of the most sought-after dining spots in the city, a place where reservations were booked weeks in advance, and where people judged worth by the price of a meal. And yet, lately, something had been bothering him. It wasn't the numbers. It wasn't the expansion deals waiting on his desk or the investors calling every morning. It was something quieter, something harder to measure. It was the way people treated those they thought didn't matter. So tonight, he stripped away the suit, the title, the identity, and stepped into his own restaurant as a stranger. A nobody. A man people could ignore. Or worse. Across the room, Maya Brooks balanced a tray of drinks with steady hands, weaving through tables with practiced ease. Her uniform was crisp but worn at the edges, her shoes comfortable but clearly not new. She moved quickly, efficiently, but there was something else in the way she carried herself, something calm, grounded, like she refused to shrink no matter how small others tried to make her feel. Ethan noticed her immediately, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way she made eye contact with every customer, even the ones who barely looked at her. Or the way she said sir and ma'am, without sounding submissive, just respectful. There was dignity there. Real dignity. The kind money couldn't buy. A loud voice cut through the air, sharp enough to make a few heads turn. Hey, this isn't what I ordered. A man in an expensive suit leaned back in his chair, his tone dripping with impatience. His table was near the center of the room, visible, impossible to ignore. Maya approached calmly, her expression neutral but attentive. I'm sorry about that, sir. Let me fix it for you right away. She reached for the plate, but the man pulled it back slightly, not aggressively, but enough to create a small pause, a moment of control. Maybe next time, you should pay attention, he said, his voice just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. A couple of people glanced over, then quickly looked away. Ethan's hands slowed in the sink. He had seen this before. The subtle shift. The way a room decides whether it will care or stay silent. Maya didn't react the way most would. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. Instead, she held his gaze, just for a second longer than expected. I understand, sir. I'll make sure it's right. Her voice stayed even, professional. She took the plate this time, turning to leave, but the man wasn't finished. You people always say that, he muttered, barely under his breath, but not quiet enough to go unnoticed. The words hung in the air, heavier than the music, heavier than the clinking glasses. And still, no one said anything. Not the manager standing near the bar. Not the couple sitting closest. Not the server passing by with a tray of wine. Silence spread like a decision. In the corner, Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He had built this place. He had set the standards. And yet here it was, unfolding right in front of him. He wiped his hands slowly, stepping out from behind the sink, drawn closer without fully realizing it. Maya stopped, just for a second. Her back straightened slightly, like she was deciding something. Then she turned around. The room seemed to quiet, not completely, but enough. She stepped back toward the table, her movements measured, her expression calm but firm. Sir, she said, her voice clear, steady, carrying farther than anyone expected. Everyone here deserves respect. 3 words lived inside that sentence, but it was more than just what she said. It was how she said it. Not angry, not afraid, just certain. Ethan froze. The sound of the kitchen faded. The room blurred at the edges. Because those words, those exact words, hit something deep, something he hadn't touched in years. A memory flickered, uninvited. A small apartment. A younger version of himself. His mother standing in a worn uniform. Coming home exhausted but still managing a smile, still managing to tell him, no matter what they say, Ethan, you deserve respect. He hadn't heard that in a long time. Not like this. Not from someone who had nothing to gain by saying it. Back in the present, the man at the table shifted uncomfortably, caught off guard not by aggression, but by the absence of it. The certainty, the quiet strength. He scoffed lightly, waving a hand. Just fix the order. Maya nodded once, turning away again, but something had changed. Not in her. In the room. Conversations resumed, but softer. Different. Ethan stood there, unmoving, his heart beating just a little faster than it should have. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about profits or expansion or control. He was thinking about her. About those words. About what it meant that the only person in his entire restaurant who chose to stand up in that moment was the one most people overlooked. And for the first time since he put on that faded apron, Ethan Cole didn't feel invisible anymore. He felt seen. And he knew, right then, that this night wasn't going to end the way he expected. The restaurant never really returned to normal after that moment, even if no one said it out loud. The music continued, the glasses kept clinking, orders were called out from the kitchen, but something invisible had shifted beneath it all, like a quiet crack forming under a polished surface. Ethan moved back toward the sink, but he was not really there anymore, not in the way he had been before. His hands went through the motions, rinsing plates, stacking them neatly, but his mind stayed fixed on the sound of her voice, steady and unshaken, cutting through a room full of people who chose silence. He had come here tonight expecting to observe patterns, to confirm suspicions he had already begun to form about entitlement and indifference, but what he did not expect was to feel something personal. Something that reached past business, past control, into a place he had spent years avoiding. Across the room, Maya continued working as if nothing had happened. She picked up orders, checked on tables, refilled drinks, her pace consistent, her tone unchanged. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the slight tightening in her shoulders, the way she took a slower breath before approaching the next table, but she did not allow the moment to define her. That, more than anything, caught Ethan's attention. She did not perform strength. She simply lived it. A younger server near the bar leaned toward another and whispered something under his breath, a quick glance in Maya's direction before both of them looked away. The manager, who had been standing just feet from the incident earlier, now pretended to be deeply focused on a tablet, scrolling through numbers that did not seem nearly as important as what had just happened. Ethan noticed all of it. Every glance. Every silence. Every choice not to act. He had built a system that rewarded efficiency, performance, presentation. But now, standing there in a damp apron with soap still on his hands, he realized something uncomfortable. He had never truly measured character. The rush of orders picked up as the evening moved forward. A group of 4 walked in without a reservation, voices loud, energy high, expecting immediate attention. Maya greeted them with the same calm professionalism, guiding them to a table, offering menus, answering questions without hesitation. Ethan watched the interaction closely, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was consistent. There was no difference in how she treated them compared to the man from earlier. No resentment. No shift in tone. Just steady respect. It made him wonder how many times she had done this before. How many moments like that she had carried without anyone noticing. A plate slipped slightly in his hands, water splashing over the edge of the sink, snapping him back for a second. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, but the feeling remained. A kind of awareness he could not turn off. After a while, Maya stepped into the service area to grab a fresh stack of napkins. For the first time that night, she was only a few feet away from him. Up close, the details became clearer. The faint crease of exhaustion near her eyes. The careful way she adjusted. Her uniform, making sure it stayed neat despite the long shift. She did not look at him right away. To her, he was just another worker, another person passing through the background. "You new here?" she asked casually, her voice softer now, without the projection she used on the floor. Ethan hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Yeah, just started." It felt strange, saying it out loud. Not because it was untrue in this moment, but because it erased everything else he was. She gave a small nod, like she had already figured that out. It gets busy, but you will get used to it. There was no judgment in her tone. No assumption. Just a simple statement, offered without expectation. Ethan found himself studying her for a second longer than he intended. Does it always get like that? He asked, his voice quieter, more careful than usual. Maya paused, understanding immediately what he meant without needing him to explain. Her eyes flickered toward the dining area, then back to him. Sometimes, she said. Depends on the night. Depends on the people. There was a brief silence between them, not uncomfortable, just real. You handled it better than most would, Ethan added, the words coming out more honest than he expected. She gave a small, almost amused exhale. You mean I did not make a scene? It was not a question. Ethan shook his head slightly. I mean you did not let it change who you are. That made her look at him. Really look at him this time. Like she was trying to understand why someone she had never met would say something like that. For a second, the roles shifted. She was the one observing. The one deciding what to make of him. Then she offered a small shrug, not dismissive, just grounded. If you let every moment like that change you, you would not recognize yourself after a while. The simplicity of it landed heavier than any speech could have. Ethan felt it again, that quiet weight settling somewhere deep inside him. Before he could respond, someone called her name from the floor. She turned slightly, ready to move, then glanced back at him for just a second. Just focus on your work, she said, not unkindly. That is how you get through the night. And then she was gone, stepping back into the light, back into the noise, back into a world that still did not fully see her. Ethan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the sounds of the kitchen returning around him, but something inside him had already started shifting in a way he could not ignore. He had come here to test others, to see who would reveal their true nature when they thought no one important was watching. But now, standing in his own restaurant, unseen and unheard, he was beginning to realize the test was not just about them. It was about him too. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole was not sure he liked what he was starting to see. The night did not slow down. It only grew louder, busier, more demanding, as if the restaurant itself refused to acknowledge what had just happened. Orders stacked up, tickets printed in rapid bursts, voices called across the kitchen in quick, practiced rhythms. But beneath it all, Ethan felt a quiet tension building that no one else seemed willing to name. He moved between the sink and the prep counter, no longer just observing, but listening more carefully than before, picking up on fragments of conversation that revealed far more than polished service ever could. She should have just kept quiet, one server muttered near the drink station, shaking his head as he wiped down a glass. Customers like that do not want a speech. Another shrugged, lowering his voice, but not enough. Yeah, but she always does that. Acts like she is trying to prove something. The words were casual, almost dismissive, but they carried weight. Not because they were loud, but because they were accepted. Ethan felt something shift again, sharper this time. It was not just one moment. It was a pattern. A culture that had been quietly forming under his ownership while he focused on expansion charts and revenue margins. Across the room, Maya continued working, unaware of the conversation or perhaps simply choosing not to react to it. She checked on a table near the window, offering a warm but measured smile, her posture relaxed but attentive. A woman at the table asked for a substitution, her tone polite but slightly impatient, and Maya handled it with ease, nodding, clarifying, making sure the request was understood without making the guest feel like a burden. It was a small interaction, ordinary to anyone else, but to Ethan, it stood in contrast to everything he had just overheard. There was no performance in her kindness. No calculation. Just consistency. A busboy rushed past Ethan, nearly bumping into him without apology, eyes fixed ahead as if anything behind him did not exist. Ethan stepped back instinctively, catching himself against the edge of the counter. For a brief second, irritation flickered through him, the kind he used to feel when things did not run smoothly under his command. But it faded just as quickly, replaced by something else. Perspective. This was how it felt to be overlooked. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just small, repeated moments that reminded you where you stood in someone else's hierarchy. He turned back toward the dining area, drawn again to Maya, not because she was the only one working hard, but because she seemed to be the only one unaffected by the invisible lines others kept drawing. A middle-aged couple flagged her down, their expressions tense, their conversation clearly strained before she even arrived. Ethan could not hear every word, but he caught enough to understand the situation was not about the food. It was about something personal, something carried into the restaurant from outside. Maya listened, not interrupting, not rushing them, giving them space in a way that felt rare in a place designed to keep things moving. "I can take this back if you would like," she offered gently. "Or I can have the kitchen adjust it however you need." The woman exhaled, her shoulders softening just slightly. "No, it is fine. Thank you for asking." It was a small de-escalation, almost invisible, but it mattered. Ethan saw it. More importantly, he felt it. This was not just service. This was awareness. Something deeper than training. Near the host's stand, the manager finally looked up from his tablet, scanning the room with a quick, surface-level glance. His eyes passed over Maya without pause, landing instead on a group that looked more likely to leave a large tip. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his posture, and walked toward them with a polished smile that felt rehearsed. Ethan watched the contrast unfold in real time. Attention given where it was expected. Respect offered where it was profitable. It was efficient. It was strategic. And suddenly, it felt wrong. The realization settled slowly, but once it arrived, it refused to leave. He had designed a system that rewarded the appearance of excellence, but not the substance of it. And the person who embodied that substance the most was the one least recognized for it. Back in the service area, Maya returned briefly, placing an order slip on the counter. She moved with the same steady rhythm, but this time, Ethan noticed something new. A slight pause when she thought no one was looking. A moment where her hand rested against the edge of the counter, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, like she was allowing herself a single breath before stepping back into the room. It lasted less than a second. Then it was gone. She picked up another tray, adjusted her grip, and walked out again, composed, controlled, consistent. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest again, but this time it was not confusion. It was recognition, not of her situation, but of his own absence from it. He had never asked what it cost to show up like that every day, never questioned how much effort it took to remain steady in a space that did not always return that steadiness. A voice from behind the line called out an order, breaking his focus. "Dishwasher, move faster, we are backed up." The tone was not cruel, just impatient, but it carried an assumption. That he was replaceable. That he was there to keep up, not to be considered. Ethan stepped forward, picking up the pace, but this time, he did not resist the feeling that came with it. He let it settle. Let it stay. Because for the first time, he was not looking at his restaurant from above. He was standing inside it, at the level where everything he had built either held up or quietly failed. And as he glanced back toward the dining floor, toward the one person who seemed to carry more than anyone else without asking for recognition, Ethan Cole began to understand that what he was witnessing was not an isolated moment. It was a reflection. And if he wanted to change anything, he would first have to admit that he had allowed it to exist in the first place. The pace of the night did not ease, but something inside Ethan had already slowed down, as if time itself had shifted its rhythm just for him. Every sound now carried meaning. Every movement revealed something he had never trained himself to notice before. Plates sliding across counters were no longer just part of a system. They were part of a story, one he had built but never truly read. He found himself watching Maya again, not out of curiosity this time, but because she had become the clearest reflection of everything he had overlooked. She moved from table to table with the same steady presence, but now he could see the layers beneath it. The way she adjusted her tone depending on the person in front of her, never changing who she was, only how she reached them. The way she anticipated needs before they were spoken, not because it increased efficiency, but because it eased tension. It was a quiet kind of leadership, the kind that did not need recognition to exist. A new table had just been seated near the back, a group of 3, dressed well, their voices carrying a tone of expectation that Ethan recognized immediately. They did not look around to take in the atmosphere. They assumed it would meet them where they were. Maya approached them with the same composed expression, offering menus, explaining the specials, her voice calm, unhurried. One of them interrupted her mid-sentence, waving a hand lightly, as if clearing space for his own thoughts. "Just bring us something good," he said, not looking at her. It was not openly disrespectful, but it carried the same quiet dismissal Ethan had begun to recognize. Maya nodded once, not reacting, not correcting, simply absorbing the moment and moving forward. Ethan felt a subtle shift in himself again, a question forming that had never occurred to him before. How many times had she been asked to adjust herself to meet someone else's comfort without anyone asking if she was comfortable at all? He turned back to the sink, but his focus did not leave the floor. The voices around him continued, orders being called, instructions given, but now they sounded different. Less like coordination and more like noise layered over something important that no one wanted to address. A cook near the grill glanced toward the dining area and shook his head slightly. "She takes too long with tables," he muttered, flipping a pan with practiced motion. "Too much talking." Another responded without looking up. "That is why people like her, I guess." There was no agreement, just a casual exchange, but it revealed the divide. Efficiency versus connection. Speed versus presence. Ethan had always chosen efficiency. It was measurable. It was scalable. It made sense. But standing here now, watching Maya turn a potentially tense table into a calm one with nothing more than patience and attention, he began to question what he had defined as success. The group at the back table laughed suddenly, louder now, their mood shifting as Maya returned with drinks, placing each one carefully, making brief eye contact just long enough to acknowledge, not long enough to intrude. The same man who had interrupted her earlier now leaned back, nodding slightly. "Thanks," he said, almost absent-minded, but it was there. A small shift. Respect, even if temporary. Ethan noticed it immediately, not because it was dramatic, but because it had been earned without force. That was when it became clear. What Maya was doing was not just maintaining the restaurant. She was shaping it. Quietly. Consistently. Without permission. Near the service counter, she paused again, checking an order before stepping back out. This time, Ethan saw something he had missed before. A folded piece of paper tucked carefully into the edge of her apron. It was worn, the corners slightly bent, like it had been opened and closed many times. She adjusted it instinctively, making sure it stayed in place before moving on. It was a small detail, easy to overlook, but for some reason, it stayed with him. It suggested something beyond the restaurant. A life that did not pause when her shift began. A weight she carried without letting it show. A server brushed past her, not unkindly, but without acknowledgement, already focused on his next table. Maya stepped aside to make space, her movement automatic, practiced. Ethan felt that shift again, sharper now, not just awareness but responsibility. This was not random. This was structure. This was what happened when a system taught people, quietly, what to value and what to ignore. He had taught them that. Not with words, but with priorities. Numbers over people. Speed over understanding. Results over impact. And now he was watching the result of that teaching play out in real time. He dried his hands slowly, no longer rushing, no longer trying to keep up with the pace of the room. For the first time, he was letting himself fall behind, just enough to see clearly. Maya moved past him again, her focus already on the next task, but as she reached for a stack of plates, one slipped slightly from the pile. Without thinking, Ethan stepped forward, steadying it before it could fall. Their hands brushed briefly, nothing dramatic, just a moment of shared motion. She looked at him, surprised for a second, then gave a small nod. "Thanks," she said simply, already moving on. The word stayed with him longer than it should have. Not because it was rare, but because it was real. It was not tied to his position, his influence, or his name. It was given to him as he was now. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan realized something that unsettled him more than anything else he had seen that night. Stripped of everything that defined him in the world outside this room, he was just another person. And the only reason that moment mattered, the only reason it felt different, was because of how she chose to treat him. Not because of who he was, but because of who she was. He glanced back toward the dining area once more, watching her disappear into the flow of movement and conversation, and a thought settled into place, quiet but undeniable. If the foundation of this place was built on anything worth keeping, it was not the brand, not the reputation, not the carefully designed experience. It was her. And the fact that she had built that foundation without recognition, without support, without even being asked, told him something he could no longer ignore. This restaurant did not need better marketing. It needed a different kind of truth. And for the first time since he stepped into that apron, Ethan Cole knew that the night was not just revealing who his employees were. It was revealing what kind of leader he had been, and whether he was willing to become something else. The night stretched further than Ethan expected, but instead of feeling drained, he felt alert in a way he had not experienced in years, like something inside him had finally been switched back on. The restaurant was still full, still alive with conversation and movement, but now he saw it differently, not as a system running smoothly, but as a collection of moments, each one revealing something about the people inside it. And the more he watched, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. Maya was not just part of the restaurant. She was the reason it worked. A sudden burst of laughter echoed from the far side of the room, followed by a sharper tone that cut through it. Ethan turned instinctively, his attention drawn back to the same table from earlier, the man who had complained before now leaning forward again, his expression tightened with impatience. "I have been waiting too long," he said, his voice louder this time, enough to pull attention from nearby tables. "This place is supposed to be better than this." A few heads turned, some curious, others already withdrawing, choosing distance over involvement. Maya approached him again, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, as if the previous moment had not happened at all. "I understand, sir. Your order is on its way. I can check with the kitchen if you would like an update." Her tone remained calm, but Ethan could see the subtle effort behind it now, the control it took to keep everything level when the situation invited imbalance. The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You keep saying that. It should not be this difficult." There it was again, not just frustration, but assumption. The belief that his experience mattered more, that his inconvenience justified his tone. Ethan felt the familiar tension rise again, but this time it did not stay internal. It moved him. Without thinking, he stepped out from behind the service area, just close enough to hear clearly, but still within the role he had chosen for himself. Maya did not react to the volume or the attention. Instead, she did something Ethan had not seen anyone else do that night. She paused, not in hesitation, but in intention. Then she spoke, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "I hear you," she said, "and I am making sure it is handled." There was no apology in her tone this time, no attempt to shrink the moment, just acknowledgement, balanced with presence. It shifted the space in a way Ethan could feel immediately. The man leaned back slightly, caught between pushing further and accepting the response. For a second, it seemed like he might continue, but then he waved his hand dismissively, turning his attention back to his table. The moment passed, but not without leaving something behind. Ethan stood there, his chest tight, not from tension this time, but from recognition. She was not just responding to the situation. She was holding her ground within it. That was different. That was rare. As Maya turned to leave, her gaze briefly crossed Ethan's. It was quick, almost unintentional, but there was something in it this time. Not curiosity, not judgment, just awareness. Like she had started to notice him in the same way he had been noticing her. He stepped back instinctively, returning to the rhythm of the kitchen, but the moment stayed with him. A few minutes later, a plate was rushed out from the line, the order finally ready. Maya picked it up, delivering it with the same composed efficiency, placing it in front of the man without any added tension. "Thank you for your patience," she said simply. He nodded, already focused on the food, the earlier frustration fading as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan watched the shift with quiet intensity. The entire moment, from tension to resolution, had been carried by her. Not by policy, not by management, by her. Back near the sink, he leaned slightly against the counter, his mind no longer scattered but focused in a way that felt new. The memory of her words from earlier returned again, clearer this time, not just as a moment, but as a pattern. "Everyone here deserves respect." It was not just something she had said. It was something she lived. And now, he was beginning to understand what made those words so powerful. They were not directed at one person. They applied to everyone, including him. A sudden call from the front broke his focus. "Maya, can you cover table 12? The manager asked, his tone efficient, not unkind, but distant. She nodded immediately, adjusting her path without question, stepping into another situation that required her presence. Ethan watched as she moved again, adapting, responding, carrying more than her role required without ever asking for acknowledgement. That was when it happened. Not a dramatic realization, not a loud decision, but something quieter, more certain. Ethan straightened slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the counter, his eyes following her as she disappeared into the flow of the room. He had come here to test others, to see who they were when they thought no one important was watching. But now, the test had changed. Because the person who had revealed the most that night was not someone trying to impress, not someone trying to protect their image. It was someone who had nothing to prove and still chose to act with integrity. And that changed everything. The noise of the restaurant continued around him, unchanged to anyone else. But for Ethan, the night had reached a point he could not ignore. The patterns were clear. The truth was visible. And for the first time, the question was no longer about what he was seeing. It was about what he was going to do next. The rhythm of the restaurant carried on. But for Ethan, every second now felt sharper, more deliberate, like the night itself was building towards something he could not yet fully see but could no longer ignore. He moved more slowly through his tasks, no longer trying to keep pace with the urgency around him, because he had begun to understand that speed had never been the real measure of anything that mattered. Across the room, Maya stepped into another interaction, this time with an older man sitting alone near the window, his posture slightly hunched, his attention fixed more on his thoughts than on the menu in front of him. She approached him with the same steady presence, setting down a glass of water before he even asked, offering a quiet greeting that did not interrupt his space, but gently acknowledged it. Ethan watched as the man looked up, surprised for a moment, then softened, just slightly, as if the simple act of being noticed had shifted something inside him. It was a small moment, almost invisible in the movement of the room, but it carried weight in a way Ethan was only now learning to recognize. Maya spoke to him in a lower tone, her voice adapted to match the quiet of his table, her posture relaxed but attentive, giving him time to respond without pressure. The man nodded slowly, pointing to something on the menu, and for the first time that night, Ethan saw a table not just being served, but being understood. That distinction stayed with him. It was not about efficiency. It was about presence. A voice from behind broke his focus. "You missed a stack," one of the cooks said, gesturing toward a pile of dishes waiting to be cleared. The tone was neutral, but it carried an expectation, the same one Ethan had once enforced without question. He stepped forward, picking up the dishes, but this time, he did not feel the urge to rush. He moved with intention, aware now that the work itself was not just about completion, but about how it was done, how it affected the flow of everything around it. As he worked, he noticed something else he had not seen before. The way different roles in the restaurant interacted, or more accurately, how they did not. The kitchen moved fast, focused on output. The floor moved fluidly, focused on experience. And somewhere in between, there was a gap, a disconnect that no one had been asked to bridge. Except Maya. She moved between both worlds without hesitation, adjusting, translating, carrying information from one side to the other in a way that kept everything from falling apart. It was not in her job description. It was not something she was recognized for. But it was essential. Ethan felt the realization settle deeper this time. This was not just about one person doing their job well. This was about someone holding together parts of a system that had never been designed to fully connect. A sudden clatter from the dish rack pulled his attention back. A plate had slipped from the edge, tilting dangerously before he caught it just in time. The motion was quick, instinctive, but it left a small tremor in his hands. Not from the effort, but from the awareness that he was no longer detached from any of this. He was part of it now, fully. A few feet away, Maya stepped back into the service area again, this time with a slower movement, like the weight of the night had finally begun to catch up with her. She reached for a glass, paused, then placed it down again, taking a brief moment to steady herself. It was subtle, but Ethan saw it clearly now. The cost of consistency. The effort it took to remain composed in a space that did not always return that same energy. He hesitated for a second, then stepped slightly closer, not enough to interrupt, but enough to be present. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice different now, less guarded, more genuine than it had been all night. Maya glanced at him, surprised again, but this time, there was something softer in her expression. Not openness, not yet, but recognition. "Yeah," she said, offering a small nod. Just a long shift. There was no complaint in her tone, No expectation of sympathy, just a simple acknowledgement of reality. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more than he could explain. "You do not slow down," he said, almost to himself. She gave a faint, tired smile, adjusting the edge of her apron where that folded paper still rested. "If I slow down, everything else does too." The words were simple, but they carried a truth that settled heavily in the space between them. Ethan felt it immediately, not just what she was saying, but what it implied. That she had taken on a responsibility no one had formally given her, and that the system around her had quietly allowed it to happen. Before he could respond, the manager called her name again, his tone sharper this time, urgency layered over expectation. "Maya, we need you on the floor now." She nodded without hesitation, stepping away, returning to the flow of the restaurant as if the moment had never happened. Ethan remained where he was, his hands resting lightly against the counter, his mind no longer racing but focused in a way that felt steady, clear. The patterns were no longer subtle. They were visible in every interaction, every decision, every silence. And for the first time, he understood that what he had built was not incomplete because it lacked success. It was incomplete because it lacked awareness. He glanced back toward the dining area once more, watching Maya move through the room with that same quiet strength, that same unshaken presence, and something inside him shifted again, this time not with uncertainty, but with direction. Because now, the question was no longer what he was seeing. It was whether he was willing to change what it meant. The night had begun to lean toward its final stretch, but the energy inside the restaurant refused to settle, as if the space itself was holding on to something unresolved. Ethan could feel it now, not just in the pace of the work, but in the atmosphere that lingered between interactions, in the pauses that no one acknowledged, in the patterns that had repeated all evening without interruption. He moved through the kitchen with a quieter presence, no longer trying to blend in, but no longer trying to hide either. Something about him had shifted, and even if no one could name it, it was there. Across the room, Maya approached another table, this one occupied by a couple dressed sharply, their posture upright, their expectations clear before a word was spoken. As she greeted them, the woman gave a polite smile, but her eyes moved quickly, scanning, assessing, deciding. "We have been here before," she said, her tone light but pointed. Service was different. The pause carried more meaning than the words themselves. Ethan felt it immediately, that subtle distinction, the way comparison was used not to inform, but to position. Maya nodded once, her expression unchanged. "I will make sure everything goes smoothly tonight," she replied, her voice steady, offering assurance without defensiveness. The man at the table leaned slightly forward. "We hope so," he added, his tone measured, but firm enough to establish expectation. It was not open hostility. It was something quieter, something more familiar. Ethan watched closely, recognizing it now for what it was. Not just pressure, but doubt, placed before she had even had the chance to prove anything. Maya did not respond to the implication. Instead, she guided the interaction forward, explaining the menu, answering questions with clarity, never rushing, never overcompensating. It was the same pattern he had seen all night, but now, with everything he had begun to understand, it felt different. It felt heavier, because now he could see what she was balancing. Not just service, perception, expectation, judgment. And still, she did not let it alter her presence. Back in the kitchen, a line cook glanced toward the table and let out a quiet breath. "Those two always complain," he muttered, adjusting a pan without looking up. "Does not matter what you do." Another voice responded from further down the line. "Yeah, but they tip well, so just keep them happy." Ethan felt the words settle into place, not as something new, but as confirmation of what he had already begun to see. Value assigned based on return. Behavior tolerated if it came with reward. It was efficient. It made sense on paper. But standing here now, it felt incomplete, because it ignored something essential. Respect should not depend on what someone leaves behind at the end of a meal. It should exist. From the beginning. He turned his attention back to the floor, just in time to see Maya return with their drinks, placing each one carefully, her movements precise, her tone consistent. The woman at the table took a sip, then gave a small nod. "This is better," she said, almost to herself, but loud enough to be heard. It was a small shift, but Ethan recognized it immediately. Not because it was significant on its own, but because of what it represented. Maya had met the expectation without ever accepting the assumption behind it. She had not changed herself to earn approval. She had remained the same, and still moved the moment forward. That was not something he had built into the system. That was something she carried on her own. A sudden call came from the front again, the host signaling that another group had arrived, larger this time, their voices already filling the entryway before they were even seated. The manager stepped forward quickly, adjusting his tone, his posture, his energy to match what he believed they expected. Ethan watched the contrast again, the way attention shifted based on perceived importance, the way presence was calibrated depending on who was watching. And then he looked back at Maya, who did not adjust in the same way. She remained consistent, not because she lacked awareness, but because she chose something different. The realization settled deeper now, no longer abstract, no longer distant. This was not just about her character. It was about his leadership, or the absence of it in moments that mattered most. As the new group was seated, Maya moved to assist, stepping in without being asked, balancing another set of expectations, another set of assumptions, another set of interactions that would require her to navigate more than just orders and timing. Ethan felt something shift again, this time not just within his understanding, but within his responsibility. Because now it was clear. She was not just adapting to the system. She was compensating for it. And that was not something he could ignore any longer. He stepped back from the sink, his hands still, his focus no longer divided. The noise of the kitchen faded slightly, not because it had quieted, but because his attention had sharpened beyond it. For the first time that night, he was not just observing. He was deciding. And as he watched Maya move through the room once more, steady, composed, carrying more than anyone had asked her to carry, Ethan Cole understood something that would not leave him. If respect was something she could offer freely, without condition, without recognition, then maybe the real failure was not in the people who withheld it. Maybe it was in the system that allowed them to believe they could. And that system, whether he had intended it or not, had his name on it. The question now was no longer whether he saw it. It was whether he was willing to change it before the night was over. The air inside the restaurant felt different now, not because the noise had changed, but because something unseen had reached a tipping point. Ethan stood still for a moment longer than he should have, his hands resting against the edge of the counter, his mind no longer circling questions, but settling into something far more dangerous. Clarity. He had spent the entire night watching, measuring, understanding, but now, for the first time, he realized that observation alone was no longer enough. Across the room, Maya was balancing yet another table, her movements just as precise, just as composed, but now Ethan could see the strain beneath it more clearly. Not weakness, but endurance. The kind that builds over time, quietly, without announcement, until it becomes part of who you are. A voice cut through the room again, not loud, but sharp enough to draw attention. "Excuse me," a man near the center table said, gesturing impatiently toward Maya. "We asked for this 10 minutes ago." The tone was not aggressive, but it carried that same expectation, that same assumption that his time outweighed everything else happening around him. Maya approached, her pace unchanged, her expression steady. "I apologize for the delay. I will check on it right now." She turned slightly, ready to move, but the man continued, his voice tightening just enough to be heard by those around him. "You people always say that." The words landed heavier this time, not because they were louder, but because Ethan now understood exactly what they carried. Not just frustration, not just impatience, something deeper. Something that had been allowed to exist in this space, without challenge. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not the quiet awareness from earlier, but something sharper, more immediate. For the first time that night, he did not stay where he was. He stepped forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with intention. The kind that changes a moment simply by being present. Maya paused, just for a second, sensing the shift before she even saw it. The room seemed to narrow slightly, attention pulling toward the center, without anyone fully realizing why. Ethan stopped a few feet from the table, still in the same worn apron, still carrying the appearance of someone who did not belong in the conversation. But something about his posture had changed. He was no longer blending in. He was standing. The man at the table glanced at him briefly, then dismissed him almost instantly, his attention returning to Maya. I do not have all night, he added, leaning back slightly, as if reinforcing his position. Maya held her composure, but Ethan could see it now. The weight of repetition, the cost of hearing the same tone, the same assumption, over and over again without interruption. And for the first time, he understood that silence was not neutral. It was permission. He stepped closer, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying something that had been absent all night. Authority. She said she will check on it, he said, his tone even, not confrontational, but firm enough to be unmistakable. The man turned his head again, this time actually looking at him, a brief flicker of confusion crossing his expression. And who are you? He asked, his tone dismissive, already preparing to disregard whatever answer came next. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. Someone who works here, he replied simply. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Then maybe you should focus on doing your job instead of interrupting. The words were familiar, the tone even more so. But this time, they did not land the same way. Because Ethan was no longer hearing them as an observer. He was standing inside them. He let the moment settle, not rushing to respond, not raising his voice, just holding the space in a way that shifted it without force. Making sure people are treated with respect is part of the job, he said, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving the man's. There was no aggression in his tone, no attempt to escalate, just clarity, the kind that does not need volume to be heard. The table fell quiet. Not completely, but enough. The man leaned back slightly, caught between pushing further and stepping back. For a second, it seemed like he might respond, but then he looked away, reaching for his glass instead. Just bring the order, he muttered, the edge in his voice dulled, if only slightly. Maya stood still for a brief moment, her gaze shifting between Ethan and the table, processing what had just happened. Then she nodded once, turning to follow through, her movements as composed as ever, but something had changed. Not in her, in the space around her. Ethan stepped back slowly, returning toward the service area, but he did not disappear this time. He did not blend back into the background. He remained visible, intentional, and for the first time that night, the room responded differently. Conversations resumed, but softer. Awareness lingered where there had once been none. And in that subtle shift, Ethan understood something that had taken him the entire night to see. Respect was not just something you offered. It was something you protected. And the moment you chose to step in, to speak, to disrupt what had been silently accepted, you changed more than just one interaction. You changed the standard. He glanced toward Maya as she moved back through the room, her posture steady, her expression unchanged to anyone who was not paying attention. But Ethan saw it. The smallest difference. Not relief. Not gratitude. Just recognition. And for the first time since he stepped into that apron, Ethan Cole was no longer testing the people around him. He was becoming part of the answer. The shift in the room did not disappear after that moment. It settled, quiet but undeniable, like a new layer had been added to the atmosphere that no one could quite name, but everyone could feel. Ethan returned to the service area, but this time he did not retreat into invisibility. He moved with the same tasks, the same motions, but there was something different in the way people glanced at him now, brief, uncertain looks that lingered just a second longer than before. It was subtle, but it was there. The space had changed because he had stepped into it. Across the dining floor, Maya continued her work, but the rhythm around her had shifted as well. Tables that had once carried a tone of quiet dismissal now seemed more measured, more aware, as if the standard had been quietly reset without announcement. A man who had previously spoken over her now paused before asking a question, his voice softer, his posture less rigid. It was not a transformation, not a complete change, but it was movement. And Ethan noticed every bit of it. Near the host's stand, the manager watched the room with a different kind of attention now, his usual confidence replaced by something closer to calculation. His eyes flicked toward Ethan more than once, as if trying to place him, to understand why a dishwasher had stepped into a situation with such calm authority and been listened to. Ethan did not acknowledge the look, but he felt it. The system was beginning to react. Back in the kitchen, the conversations had shifted as well, quieter, less certain. "Did you see that?" one of the servers whispered, glancing toward the dining area. "He just stepped in like that." Another shrugged, but there was hesitation in the gesture. "Yeah, But did you notice? The guy actually backed off. There was no clear conclusion, just observation, but it was enough. Ethan understood what was happening. The moment had created a ripple, and now everyone was trying to make sense of it. He turned back toward the floor, his attention finding Maya again, not because he was searching for her, but because she had become the center of everything that mattered in this space. She moved between tables with the same steady presence, but now, there was something else in the way people responded to her. A slight pause before speaking. A moment of consideration where there had once been none. It was not recognition yet, not fully, but it was the beginning of something. Maya approached a table near the middle, a family of 3, their conversation light, their energy relaxed. As she greeted them, the child looked up at her with open curiosity, unfiltered, unaffected by the quiet tensions that had shaped the rest of the room. "Hi," the child said simply, smiling. Maya smiled back, her expression softening in a way Ethan had not seen before, not because it was different, but because it was unguarded. "Hi there," she replied, her tone warm, natural, untouched by the weight she had carried all night. Ethan felt something shift again, this time. Not sharp, not heavy, but clear. This was what it looked like when respect was given without condition, without hesitation, without calculation. It was simple, and yet it was rare. The moment passed quickly as she took their order, returning to the rhythm of the room, but it stayed with him longer than anything else that had happened that night, because it showed him something he could not ignore. The difference between learned behavior and natural instinct. Between what people chose to do and what they had been taught to accept. A call from the kitchen broke his focus again, an order needing to be run, plates lining up on the counter, waiting to be delivered. Without thinking, Ethan stepped forward, picking up one of the trays, his movements automatic, but his intention different. He stepped onto the floor, not as an observer, not as someone passing through, but as someone participating. The weight of the tray was familiar, but the perspective was not. As he moved through the tables, he felt the subtle shifts in attention, the way people glanced at him, then away, categorizing him quickly, placing him within a role that defined his value in their eyes. It was the same pattern he had watched all night. But now, he was inside it completely. He reached the table, placing the dishes down carefully, his movements precise, his presence steady. "Here you go," he said simply, his voice neutral, offering the same level of care Maya had shown all evening. The man at the table nodded briefly, barely looking up, already focused on the food. No acknowledgement. No eye contact. Just assumption. Ethan straightened slightly, stepping back, and for a moment, he let himself feel it fully. Not the frustration. Not the impulse to correct. Just the experience itself. The quiet dismissal. The absence of recognition. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it was real. And now, it was undeniable. As he turned to walk back toward the service area, his eyes met Maya's again across the room. This time, the look held for a fraction longer. There was something different in it now. Not just awareness. Understanding. She had seen what he had done. And more importantly, she had seen why. Ethan felt the connection settle, not as something spoken, but as something shared. Two people standing in the same space, navigating the same system, but from different positions. And for the first time, those positions did not feel as distant as they had before. Back in the kitchen, he set the tray down, his hands steady, his mind clear in a way that left no room for hesitation. The night had shown him everything he needed to see. Not just about his restaurant, but about himself. About what he had allowed, what he had overlooked, what he had mistaken for success. And now, there was only one question left, one that no longer felt abstract or distant. It felt immediate, necessary, because understanding meant nothing if it did not lead to action. And as Ethan Cole stood there, no longer hidden, no longer uncertain, he knew that whatever came next would not just change the rest of the night. It would change everything that followed. The moment did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It arrived with stillness, the kind that settles just before something changes for good. Ethan stood at the edge of the service area, no longer moving, no longer pretending to be just another part of the system, because now he understood that staying silent would mean becoming part of the problem he had spent the entire night uncovering. The restaurant continued around him, conversations flowing, plates moving, orders being called, but for him, everything had narrowed into a single, undeniable decision. Across the room, Maya was finishing up at a table, her posture still composed, her movements still measured, but now Ethan could see something deeper in the way she carried herself. Not just endurance, but resilience. The kind that does not come from one moment, but from many. The kind that builds quietly, without recognition, until it becomes the foundation of who you are. He took a slow breath, then stepped forward, not toward the kitchen, not toward the exit, but toward the center of the room. It was a small movement, but it shifted everything. A few heads turned, not because they recognized him, but because something about his presence no longer matched the role he had been playing. The manager noticed first, his eyes narrowing slightly, as Ethan moved past him without stopping, without asking, without waiting. "Hey," he started, his voice low but sharp. "Where are you going?" Ethan did not slow down. "To fix something," he replied simply, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that made the manager hesitate instead of interrupting again. That hesitation was all he needed. He stepped further into the room, the space opening around him in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet completely natural at the same time. Conversations softened, not stopping entirely, but shifting just enough to acknowledge that something different was happening. Maya noticed him next. She paused mid-step, her attention locking onto him, not because she understood what he was about to do, but because she sensed the change before it fully revealed itself. Ethan stopped near the center, not raising his voice, not drawing attention through volume, but through presence. "Everyone," he said, his tone steady, clear enough to carry without force. The word itself caused a ripple, a subtle pause in the room as people turned, curious, uncertain, trying to understand why someone in a worn apron was addressing them. The manager stepped forward again, this time more urgent. "You cannot just." Ethan turned slightly, meeting his gaze for just a moment, and something in that look made the manager stop mid-sentence. It was not anger. It was not defiance. It was certainty. Ethan faced the room again, his posture straight, his voice calm, but unmistakable. "I have been here all night," he continued, "watching how this place runs, watching how people are treated, watching what we allow." The room grew quieter now, not silent, but attentive in a way it had not been before. "And I realized something," he said, his eyes moving briefly across the space, taking in the staff, the guests, the system he had built without fully seeing. "We have been measuring the wrong things." A soft murmur moved through the room, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to show that people were listening, even if they did not understand yet. Maya stood still, her attention fixed on him, her expression unreadable, but focused. Ethan continued, his voice steady, grounded in something deeper than authority. "We focus on speed, on presentation, on profit, and those things matter, but they are not what people remember." He paused, just long enough for the words to settle. "What people remember is how they are treated." The simplicity of it cut through the room in a way nothing else had that night. Not dramatic, not complex, just true. "And tonight," he said, his gaze shifting slightly, landing on Maya. For just a second before returning to the room, one person showed what that is supposed to look like. The attention followed his glance, subtle at first, then clearer, as more eyes turned toward her. Maya did not move. She did not step forward. She simply stood there, caught in a moment she had never asked for. Ethan took another breath, then did something he had not planned when the night began. Something that could not be undone. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said, his voice calm, but carrying through the entire space with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "And I own this restaurant." The words landed like a shift in gravity. Conversations stopped completely now, silence replacing the hum that had filled the room all evening. The manager froze, his expression changing instantly, recognition replacing confusion. The staff looked at each other, then back at Ethan, then at Maya, trying to piece together what they had just witnessed. Maya's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in realization, as the pieces came together all at once. Ethan held the moment, not rushing to fill it, allowing the weight of what he had revealed to settle fully before continuing. "And if there is one thing I am certain of after tonight," he said, his voice softer now, but no less steady, "it is that respect is not optional here." He turned slightly, his gaze finding Maya again, but this time, it did not move away. "It is the standard." The room remained still, the silence no longer uncertain, but expectant, as if waiting to see what would happen next. And for the first time that night, Ethan Cole was no longer hidden, no longer observing from the shadows. He was standing in full view of everything he had built, ready to change it. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like the room itself was learning how to breathe again under a new weight. Ethan remained where he stood, no longer hidden behind a role, no longer separated from the consequences of what he had built, and for the first time, every pair of eyes in the room was on him without confusion about who he was. The manager stepped forward first, his posture suddenly formal, his voice carefully controlled. "Mr. Cole, I did not realize you were here tonight," he said, attempting to recover the authority he had carried earlier, but there was a hesitation beneath it now, a recalibration happening in real time. Ethan glanced at him briefly, not dismissive, but no longer deferential. "That is the point," he replied calmly. "You were not supposed to." The words settled quickly, cutting through any attempt to reframe the moment as anything other than what it was. Around them, the staff stood still, some holding trays, others frozen mid-task, all caught between uncertainty and awareness. Conversations among the guests had stopped entirely now, curiosity replacing casual indifference, as if they were witnessing something they had not expected to be part of. Ethan shifted his attention back to the room, his voice steady, not raised, but clear enough that no one could misunderstand. "Tonight was not about catching mistakes," he continued. "It was about understanding what happens when people think no one important is watching." He let the sentence sit, allowing the meaning to settle before continuing. "And what I saw was not a failure of skill. It was a failure of standard." The manager straightened slightly, his instinct to defend rising. "We maintain high service expectations here," he said, his tone measured, but edged with tension. Ethan nodded once. "You do," he agreed. "But service is not the same as respect." The distinction landed heavily, not because it was complicated, but because it was undeniable. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze moving across the staff, not accusing, not targeting, but including. "We have trained people how to serve," he said, "but we have not trained them how to value each other." A few employees shifted uncomfortably, the truth of the statement settling in ways they had not anticipated. Ethan's eyes found Maya again, not as a focal point of attention, but as the example that had made everything else clear. "And yet," he added, his voice softening just slightly, "someone here has been doing both, without being asked, without being recognized, and without changing who she is." The attention followed again, more directly this time, settling on Maya in a way that was no longer subtle. She stood still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression composed, but the weight of the moment now fully visible around her. She did not step forward. She did not react. She simply remained present, the same way she had all night. Ethan took a small step closer, not to elevate her, but to stand beside what she represented. "What you said earlier," he continued, his voice quieter now, but carrying through the room with even more clarity. "Everyone here deserves respect." The words returned, not as a repetition, but as a foundation. "That is not just something we say," he added. "That is something we enforce." The shift in language was deliberate, and everyone felt it. The manager's expression tightened slightly, understanding now that this was not a moment that would pass without change. "We will address any concerns," he said quickly, trying to regain control of the narrative. Ethan shook his head slightly, not dismissing, but correcting. "This is not about addressing concerns," he said. "This is about changing expectations." The distinction was clear, and it left no room for interpretation. He turned back toward the room, his posture steady, his presence grounded in something that no longer needed to be proven. "From this point forward," he said, "how we treat each other is not secondary to how we serve guests. It is the standard that everything else is built on." The words settled into the space with a weight that felt permanent, not like a policy, but like a shift in foundation. No one spoke. No one interrupted. Because for the first time, the structure they had been operating within had been redefined in a way that could not be ignored. Ethan paused, then added one more thing, not as an instruction, but as a truth he had learned too late to ignore. "And respect does not depend on position," he said. "It does not depend on who is paying or who is serving. It is either present or it is not." The room remained still, the silence now filled with understanding rather than uncertainty. Ethan stepped back slightly, not retreating, but allowing the moment to settle fully without forcing it further. Across from him, Maya finally moved. Not toward him, not toward the center, but back into the rhythm of the restaurant, picking up a tray, continuing her work as if the moment had not changed who she was at all. And that, more than anything else, confirmed what Ethan had come to understand. She had never needed the room to recognize her for her to be who she was. But now, the room had no choice but to see it. The restaurant did not return to what it had been before, and it did not try to. The shift lingered, not as tension, but as awareness, something quieter but far more lasting. Conversations resumed, orders continued, plates moved from kitchen to table, but there was a difference now in how people occupied the space. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who was not paying attention, but it was there. Ethan stepped back toward the service area, not to disappear again, but to observe what came after change had been introduced. Because he knew something now that he had not fully understood before. A moment could start a shift, but what happened next determined whether it stayed. Across the room, Maya continued her work, but this time, the interactions around her carried a different tone. A man who had previously spoken without looking at her now paused before placing his order, his voice measured, his posture more aware. A woman who had barely acknowledged her earlier now offered a small thank you as she set down a glass. These were not dramatic changes. They were small, but they were real, and Ethan noticed every one of them. Near the kitchen, the manager stood with his arms crossed, watching the floor with a focus that was no longer routine. He was not just monitoring efficiency anymore. He was watching behavior. The difference was clear, even if he did not fully understand it yet. A server approached him quietly, lowering her voice. "Are we supposed to change how we handle things?" she asked, her tone uncertain, not resistant, but cautious. The manager hesitated, then glanced toward Ethan, who stood just within view, no longer hidden, but not commanding the room either. "We follow the standard," he replied finally, his voice more careful than before. But the words sounded different now, because the standard itself had changed. Ethan heard the exchange, not because it was loud, but because he was listening for it. This was the part that mattered. Not the declaration. The adjustment. The way people began to recalibrate their actions when the expectation shifted. Maya stepped into the service area again, placing an order slip on the counter, her movement steady, unchanged. But this time, someone moved aside for her without needing to be asked. A small gesture. Automatic. Respect given without friction. She did not react to it. She simply continued, as she always had. Ethan watched the moment closely, understanding that what made it meaningful was not that it happened, but that it had not happened before. A cook handed her a plate, his tone different now. "Careful, it is hot," he said, not as a warning, but as consideration. Maya gave a small nod. "Got it, thank you." The exchange was brief, ordinary, but it carried something new. Balance. Ethan felt a quiet sense of clarity settle deeper within him. This was not about creating perfection. It was about creating awareness. About shifting what people noticed, what they valued, what they allowed. And for the first time, he could see it taking shape in real time. Maya turned to leave the service area again, but this time, she paused. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. She looked at Ethan, her expression calm, but her gaze direct. There was no confusion in it now. No uncertainty about who he was or what had happened. Just understanding. "You did not have to do that," she said, her voice quiet, steady, not questioning, just stating. Ethan held her gaze, his response immediate, but measured. "Yes, I did." The simplicity of it left no room for anything else. Maya studied him for a brief second, as if weighing the truth of his words, then gave a small nod. Not approval, not agreement, just acknowledgement. "Then make sure it stays that way," she said. The words were not a request. They were a standard. And Ethan felt the weight of them settle in a way nothing else had that night. He nodded once, not as a gesture, but as a commitment. "It will," he replied. Maya did not respond. She turned, stepping back into the flow of the restaurant, carrying the same presence she had from the beginning, unchanged by recognition, unchanged by attention. And that was what made it matter. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching as the room continued to adjust around her, around the shift that had begun, around the standard that had been spoken into existence but now needed to be lived. He understood something now with complete clarity. Change did not happen in the moment it was declared. It happened in the moments that followed, in the choices people made when no one was speaking, when no one was watching. And that was where his responsibility truly began. He glanced around the restaurant once more, taking in the movement, the interactions, the subtle shifts that were still unfolding. This place, the one he had built, was no longer defined by what it looked like from the outside. It was defined by what happened inside it, moment by moment, choice by choice. And as Ethan Cole stood there, no longer observing, no longer questioning, but understanding, he knew that the real test had not been earlier that night. The real test had just begun. The night finally began to settle, not with a sudden stop, but with a gradual quieting, like a long-held breath being released across the entire room. The last few tables lingered, conversations softer now, the earlier tension replaced by something more reflective, more aware. Ethan stood near the edge of the dining floor, no longer moving between roles, no longer blending into the background, but also no longer needing to command attention. The shift had already happened. Now he was watching what remained. Maya moved through the final stretch of her shift with the same steady presence. But there was a difference in the way the room met her now. A couple near the window thanked her as she cleared their table, not out of obligation, but with intention. A man who had been distant earlier met her eyes briefly, offering a quiet nod before leaving. These were not grand gestures. They did not erase what had come before, but they marked something new. A beginning. Ethan noticed each one, not as victories, but as confirmations. Proof that change did not need to be loud to be real. Near the service area, the manager approached him again, his posture no longer defensive, but measured, as if he understood now that the conversation had moved beyond control and into responsibility. "I will make sure this is followed through," he said, his voice steady, but lacking the certainty it once had. Ethan looked at him, not with judgment, but with clarity. "Do not make sure," he replied calmly. "Understand it." The distinction landed, not harsh, but firm enough to remain. The manager nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what that meant, then stepped back, returning to the floor with a different kind of focus than before. Maya stepped into the service area one last time, placing down a tray, her movements slightly slower now, the long shift finally catching up to her. She reached for the folded piece of paper in her apron, adjusting it carefully before slipping it back into place. Ethan noticed it again, but this time, he did not let it pass without question. "What is that?" he asked gently, his tone curious, not intrusive. Maya hesitated for a second, then pulled the paper out, unfolding it just enough for him to see. It was a simple note, handwritten, the edges worn from being handled too often. "It is something my mom used to tell me," she said quietly. Ethan glanced down at the words, reading them in silence. "You still matter." The same 3 words. The ones that had stopped him at the beginning of the night. The ones that had followed him through every moment since. He looked up at her, the connection now complete, not just in understanding, but in meaning. "You carry that with you every day?" he asked. Maya nodded once, folding the paper carefully, placing it back where it belonged. "Some days, you need a reminder," she said simply. Ethan felt something settle in his chest, not heavy this time, but clear, defined. The night had started with him questioning others, measuring what they did when they thought no one important was watching. But now, standing here, he understood something he had missed for far too long. Importance had never been about position. It had always been about presence. Maya picked up her bag, her shift finally over, her posture relaxing just slightly as the responsibility of the room lifted from her shoulders. She paused for a moment, looking at Ethan, not as an employee looks at an owner, but as one person looks at another who has chosen to change. "Good night," she said, her voice calm, steady, the same as it had been all evening. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded. "Good night, Maya." There was no need for more. No need for promises spoken out loud. Because the standard had already been set. And now, it would be proven in what came next. She turned and walked toward the exit, her steps unhurried, her presence unchanged, leaving the space just as she had held it all night, with quiet strength that did not ask to be seen. Ethan watched her go, not with curiosity, not with admiration alone, but with understanding. The kind that changes how you lead, how you build, how you decide what matters. The restaurant around him continued to settle, lights dimming slightly, staff beginning to reset for the next day, but the space no longer felt the same. Because it was not. He looked around one last time, taking in the room not as it had been, but as it could become. A place where respect was not assumed, not requested, but practiced. A place where presence mattered more than position. A place where no one had to carry a reminder just to believe they belonged. Ethan Cole stood there for a moment longer, then turned, stepping forward into the work that would follow, not as a man returning to control, but as a leader who finally understood what it meant to deserve it.